We're going to take a look at solving absolute value equations. Now, you may or may not have seen absolute values in the past, so let's go through what they actually are real quick. An absolute value is an operator that tells you the distance a number is from the number 0 on the number line. So think about it like this. If I gave you a number, say there's 0, and I gave you the number 7, and kind of think about it as walking. You say, how far is it from 0 to 7? And you'd say, well, it would take 7 steps to get over there. Or if I gave you -5, and I said, how far from 0 is -5? You'd say, well, it would take me 5 steps. The negative is just really kind of telling you a direction, right? Positive says go that way, negative goes that way. So one way that a lot of students think about absolute value, and this isn't a definition, but the way that they think about it is the answer to an absolute value is always positive, right? Because distance is a positive value. We generally don't think of distance as something that's negative. Now, that's really the kind of layman's term. So, very simply, by the way, I'm guessing we've all seen. So, we use the straight up and down bars for the absolute value. So, this is the absolute value of 5, of course, would be 5. And the absolute value of -8 would be 8, right? Because -8's 8 steps away from 0. Now, there is a scary looking mathematical definition for this, and we're going to need it to help us solve the equations, but don't let this scare you too much. I'll walk you through it. This is called what's commonly known as a piecewise function. We're going to work with piecewise functions a little bit more in the future, but this is just really quick. See, the absolute value has two options. If you're taking the absolute value of some number, well, the answer is just going to be that number if x is positive, and it's going to be the opposite of that number if x is negative. All right, let's see what that means. If you're taking the absolute value of a positive number, right? The absolute value of a positive number is just that number, right? So you say the absolute value of something is just that thing if it's positive. However, and we don't normally write this step in here, you kind of think about it like this. In this case, our x here would be -8. Since -8 is less than 0, our answer has to be the opposite of -8. Well, the opposite of a negative is a positive. Now, we don't generally use this in practice to find the absolute value of numbers, but we can use it to help us solve equations. Now, as far as 0 goes, since positive and -0, because there's no such thing as positive or -0, 0 fits into either case here. So you can put the equal sign on one or both or neither. It doesn't really matter. All right, so let's take a look on how we can use this to help us solve an equation. Let's start with a very simple one that we can just look at and see what the answer is. This says the absolute value of what number is 5, or what number is a distance of 5 steps away from 0. Well, hopefully it'd be easy to see that the number 5 would work, but also, since the number line is kind of a mirror image of itself, -5 would also work, right? Because if you think about what numbers are 5 steps away from 0, that's 5 steps away from 0, and so is -5. That's also 5 steps. So for most of our absolute values, we should get 2 answers because there's a mirror image of every number on the other side. All right, well, that makes sense, and there's the 2 answers, but we just kind of looked at it and said, this is the answer. So how do we mathematically go after this? Well, we can do it like this. I'm going to just kind of draw a line and show you how using this craziness actually works to help get us to an answer. Well, we said the absolute value of something, remember that's what x is, it's something, we don't know what it is. The absolute value of something is 5. Well, since we don't know what x is, there's only 3 possibilities for x. Either it's a positive number, it's a negative number, or it's 0. Well, we know it's not 0 because the absolute value of 0, of course, is 0. Well, 0 doesn't equal 5, so we know x isn't 0. So there's really only 2 cases here. Either x is greater than 0, positive, or x is less than 0. The only two things that x can be. It's got to be either a positive number or a negative number. So let's do the first case. If x is greater than 0. Well, according to our definition of the absolute value, if x is greater than 0, then the absolute value of x is just x. If x is greater than 0, the absolute value of x is just x. So, the equation, the absolute value of x equals x, becomes just x equals 5. Right? All we did is replace the absolute value of x with x by its definition. If x is less than 0, then by definition, according here to this, if x is less than 0, the absolute value of x is the opposite of x. So our equation, actually you need to put all the letters in there. Our equation becomes negative x is equal to 5. Now we can finish solving that real quick. Just divide both sides by -1, we get x is equal to -5. Now notice, it was a lot more work, but by using the definition, we got to the same two answers that we got to just kind of using our intuition. Now, if you can use your intuition and just write down the answer, that's fine. However, you're not always going to be able to do that. So let me put this down as some steps for us. I'm going to come over here to the side like we normally do. And steps. Step 1, isolate the absolute value. Basically what I mean is get that thing on the side all by itself. Step 2, we're going to ask a question. Does it make sense? Now leave yourself a little line right there. I'm going to write something in there in a second if you're copying down with me. All right, so once we isolate the absolute value, we're going to see does it make sense. Step 3, we're going to break it into two equations. The first equation just drop the absolute value. Right, if you take a look at this equation here, when we started with this equation, when we replaced it by the definition, when we used this, it really just took this equation and we wrote it without the absolute value. The second one, you're going to replace the absolute value with parentheses with a negative in front. So basically this time, and I'm going to kind of erase that line here so we can see a little bit better. So what do we do here? We basically just replace the absolute values with a negative sign in front of that. Well, since the stuff inside the absolute values most of the time is going to be more than one thing, we do need parentheses around it, which we didn't quite show here. So we're going to replace these absolute values with parentheses and that negative. All right, step 4, you're going to solve both. And step 5, we're going to talk about what we have to do to check these. All right, so let's try a couple of these. Get ourselves some room to work here. Now, the good news is, since these are always going to be linear, these are really just going to be solving linear equations with a couple extra steps. So let's say I just said the directions were solved, and I said 2x plus 3 plus 4 is equal to, I don't know, 6. All right, so again, we got to classify this thing. This is an absolute value equation because our variable's inside an absolute value and we have an equal sign. To be a little bit more specific here, it is linear, but we're going to see that we're going to use that in a second. So we know we want to isolate the absolute value. That means get this thing on the side completely by itself. Well, it's not because we still have this plus 4 over here. So just like solving an equation, we're going to subtract 4 from both sides. So 2x plus 3 is equal to 2. Now this is where I said, does this make sense? Because this is a way that you can get out of a few of the problems quickly. What do we know about the absolute value? Well, we know we're talking about distance, and we know that it has to always be positive. So at this stage right here, if you have the absolute value equaling a negative, you can stop because you know that that's impossible. So here, and I'm just going to write a quick little sentence, if you have the absolute value equaling a negative, it's no solution. You can stop right there. Problem's done. You don't have no more work to do. However, in this case, you see we have the absolute value equaling a positive, so we actually have to continue going. So we're going to break this into two equations. So the first equation, I'll write this just without the absolute values at all. The second, I'm going to replace the absolute values with parentheses, and I'm going to put a negative in front. Now, I highly suggest that you write down both of these at the same time. A lot of times, especially if you're in a testing environment, students get nervous and they write this one down and they solve it and they forget to go back and do the other one. So write them both down at the same time, then go back and solve them. So following our steps for linear equations, clear grouping symbols, clear fractions or decimals, move all your variables to one side, move everything else to the other side and divide. Kind of going through that rather quick. We get one value. Again, let's clear our grouping symbols, clear fractions or decimals, move all your variables to one side, everything else to the other side, and then divide. We get x is equal to negative 5/2. Okay, so we got our two answers, and that's what we expected, that almost every time we should get two answers with an absolute value equation because we have a mirror distance on each side. Now, that got us through step 4. Now, step 5 said check. You know, especially on a test, you absolutely should check these. However, air quote, however here, if you answered 2 correctly, if you have the absolute value equaling a positive number, and you did this work correctly, these will always check. However, if you didn't answer this correctly or made a mistake, of course, they won't check. Now, just for time's sake here, you can go through and prove it to yourself. I'm just going to go ahead and say that these check, so these are our answers. All right, so you see, it's really just solving a couple of linear equations with a few steps right before it, so make sure that you're practicing that. All right, let's try another one here. What if I had... All right, another absolute value equation, and if we want to be a little bit more specific, it is still a linear absolute value equation. So following our steps, step 1 says isolate the absolute value. This absolute value is not on the side all by itself, so we need to move that to the other side, so let's subtract 10. So I get the absolute value of x plus 4 is equal to negative 5. Now you don't want to skip step 2 because, as you can see in this one, here, now that we have the absolute value all by itself, we have the absolute value equaling a negative. We're done. This is no solution. And you can stop right there. That problem is done. You don't have to go any farther. Now, for this one example, I'm going to keep going because I'm going to show you, unlike when we were solving linear equations at the first couple of days, to get no solution, you had to have something weird happen, right? All the variables had to go away and you had to get a false statement. Nothing like that's going to happen here. We're going to get 2 perfectly fine looking answers. The problem is they won't check. Watch, let's give this a shot. So let's break this into 2 equations now. So I have x plus 4 is equal to negative 5. The first one I just dropped the absolute value. Next one I replace the absolute value with parentheses and a negative in front. Solving each one of these, we get x is equal to negative 9. Distributing 4 negative x is equal to negative 1. So we get x is equal to 1. So notice we got 2 perfectly fine looking answers. Like nothing's wrong with those whatsoever. So you'd be, if you weren't paying attention here and you thought you did the work right, you put boxes around those and you keep going. And you would lose points because, let me go and get our steps out of here. These don't check. Let's take a look. Remember, always to check, you go back to the original equation. So let's check x equals negative 9. So that would be negative 9 plus 4 plus 10 is equal to 5. It's the absolute value of negative 5 plus 10 is equal to 5. Well, the absolute value of negative 5 is positive 5. Well, 15 does not equal 5. So that does not check. So this cannot be an answer. But we do the same thing with, 1. Get the absolute value of 1 plus 4 plus 10 is 5. Absolute value of 5 plus 10 is 5. Same thing, 5 plus 10 is 5. 15 does not equal 5. So neither of these two work. So since neither one of those work, we would get to the same conclusion, I got a red pen here somewhere, that we would have no solution. But notice we had to do a lot more work for this. That's the reason you really want to pay attention at step 2. Once you get that absolute value isolated, check to see if it's equal to a negative. If it's equal to a negative, you have no solution. If it's equal to a positive, you do have to go through all the work. And to be safe, at least at this stage, you should always check these just to make sure.